In 1944, a squadron of American B-29 bombers, crippled after raids over Japan, made emergency landings inside the territory of their own ally, the Soviet Union. They expected to be sent home. Instead, they were quietly locked away for months. And when the two governments finally decided to let them go, they didn't call it a release. They staged an escape. By 1944, American B-29 superfortresses were flying long-range bombing missions against Japan from bases in China. Brutal, exhausting flights that pushed both planes and crews to their limits. Damage from anti-aircraft fire was common, and for a crippled bomber too far gone to make it back to base, there was only one realistic option nearby: Soviet territory, just across the border. The Soviet Union was, at this point, an American ally against Germany, but it had a separate, carefully maintained neutrality pact with Japan, one it had no intention of breaking early. That single detail was about to turn a rescue landing into something far stranger. By 1944, the United States and the Soviet Union had built one of the odder arrangements of the entire war: shuttle bombing. American bombers flying long-range missions from bases in England and Italy would strike targets deep in German-held territory, then continue eastward and land at airfields inside Soviet-controlled Ukraine and Poland, refuel and rearm, and strike more targets on the way back west. It required American air crews to operate again and again on ground that belonged entirely to their Soviet ally, men who did not answer to American commanders, did not share American priorities, and in many cases did not fully trust the men they were hosting. For the American airmen involved, these landings meant something else too: a front-row view of a part of the war rarely discussed back home, the reality of life in newly Soviet-controlled Poland, where the Red Army wasn't just fighting Germans, it was also actively hunting down members of the Polish Home Army, the underground resistance movement that had spent years fighting the Nazi occupation and now found itself treated as an enemy by the very army it had hoped would liberate it. Among the American pilots flying these missions were two lieutenants, Myron King and Donald Bridge. Both were exactly the kind of officer the U.S. Army Air Forces relied on for these missions: experienced, trusted with aircraft worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and accustomed to operating far from direct oversight, deep inside a foreign, occupied, war-torn landscape. What neither of them could have expected was that a routine flight home would end not with a medal, not with a quiet return to base, but with a formal court-martial, a criminal trial, conducted by their own country for the crime of showing basic human decency to someone their host nation had decided was an enemy. On one of these flights, Lieutenant King's B-17 carried an unauthorized passenger back toward Allied lines, a man later identified by Soviet authorities as a terrorist saboteur. In reality, according to the U.S. National Archives' own account of the incident, this man appears to have been connected to the Polish underground resistance, precisely the kind of person the Soviets, now consolidating political control over Poland, wanted found, arrested, and removed from circulation. To an American pilot standing on a foreign airfield, sympathetic to people who had spent years resisting Nazi occupation, the decision to help a desperate man escape an increasingly hostile occupying force may have felt less like a crime and more like simple human decency. To the Soviets, it was something else entirely: an American officer interfering directly in what Moscow considered its own internal political affair, using American aircraft to smuggle a wanted man out of Soviet-controlled territory. The reaction from Soviet military leadership was immediate and severe. In a letter dated March 30, 1945, Soviet General Alexei Antonov wrote directly to his American counterpart, General John Dean, reminding him, in pointed language, that it was only because of the Allied relationship that Soviet forces permitted American bombers to land and operate on territory the Red Army had fought and bled to control. Antonov's complaint went further, describing incidents where American air crews had, in his words, failed to live up to elementary rules of a relationship between friendly nations, a diplomatic way of saying American officers were increasingly seen as overstepping their welcome, interfering in matters Moscow considered strictly its own business. This wasn't a minor diplomatic footnote. By March 1945, with the war against Germany entering its final months and difficult post-war negotiations already looming on the horizon, Washington had no appetite for a genuine rupture with Moscow over the fate of 2 junior officers and 1 unauthorized passenger. Faced with Soviet anger and the broader strategic need to keep the wartime alliance intact through the war's final stretch, American commanders made a choice that would have seemed unthinkable to the men involved just months earlier. Rather than defend their own officers or quietly reprimand them out of the public eye, the U.S. Army Air Forces moved to formally court-martial Lieutenants King and Bridge. In the last week of April 1945, even as Allied forces were closing in on Berlin and the war in Europe was mere days from ending, general courts-martials were convened, more than 1,000 miles apart, to try 2 American officers for actions that, stripped of their political context, amounted to helping a man escape a regime already notorious for its brutal treatment of political opponents. The verdict, delivered by secret written ballot, was guilty. It's worth sitting with what this verdict actually meant. These were not men accused of endangering a mission, damaging equipment, or committing violence. Their offense was extending help to someone fleeing an occupying force, a force that happened, for the moment, to be officially classified as an ally. For King and Bridge, the consequence of that choice was a formal criminal conviction on their military record, delivered not because American commanders believed they'd done something morally wrong, but because punishing them was the price of keeping a fragile, distrustful alliance from fracturing during the war's critical final weeks. Their own government chose, deliberately, to sacrifice 2 of its own officers' records and reputations in order to avoid antagonizing Moscow. This wasn't an isolated moment of American deference to Soviet demands. Throughout 1944 and 1945, as Soviet forces advanced deeper into Eastern Europe, similar tensions repeated themselves again and again at the edges of the alliance. American personnel stationed on or passing through Soviet-controlled territory routinely found themselves caught between their own instincts, sympathy for occupied peoples, basic wartime camaraderie, simple human decency, and the hard, unsentimental demands of an alliance built on temporary necessity rather than shared values. In case after case, when these tensions surfaced, it was overwhelmingly American commanders who chose to bend, to apologize, to discipline their own men, rather than risk the appearance of undermining Soviet authority in territory the Red Army had fought to control. It was a pattern of accommodation that, in hindsight, foreshadowed exactly how little say ordinary people across Eastern Europe would have in their own post-war fate, and how willing the Western allies already were, even before the war ended, to look away. Within months of these court-martials, the war in Europe ended entirely, and within a remarkably short time after that, the wartime alliance that had demanded this kind of American deference began to collapse on its own terms. The same Soviet Union that Washington had gone out of its way not to offend in the spring of 1945 would within 2 years be publicly identified by American leaders as the central threat of the emerging Cold War. The men King and Bridge had tried to help, Polish resistance fighters, caught between a departed Nazi occupation and an incoming Soviet one, would spend the following decades largely written out of the West's own triumphant memory of World War II, their fate overshadowed first by VE Day celebrations, and later by a Cold War narrative more comfortable focusing on Soviet aggression abroad than on the moments Western governments had quietly cooperated with it. What makes this incident worth telling isn't simply that it happened, it's what it reveals about the true nature of the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union. It wasn't a partnership built on shared values or mutual trust. It was a temporary, transactional necessity, and when that necessity required Washington to prosecute its own men for an act of basic decency, Washington did so without much hesitation. 2 American officers carried a genuine criminal conviction for the rest of their military careers, not because their country believed they were wrong, but because appeasing an ally mattered more, in that specific moment, than defending them. Today, the story of Lieutenants King and Bridge survives mostly in a single detailed National Archives account, buried far from the more familiar, triumphant narratives of the Second World War's final months. It's a quiet, uncomfortable footnote to the story of victory, a reminder that even as the guns fell silent across Europe, the alliance that had won the war was already beginning to reveal exactly how little room it left for the individual conscience of the men who'd fought it.